Break Fix's History of Motorsports series is brought to you in part by the International Motor Racing Research Center, as well as the Society of Automotive Historians, the Watkins Glen Area Chamber of Commerce, and the Argetsinger family.
Donald C. Davidson was the historian of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway from 1998 to 2020, and the only person to hold such a position on a full-time basis for any motorsports facility in the world. Davidson started his career as a statistician, publicist, and historian at USAC. His radio program, The Talk of Gasoline Alley, is broadcast annually throughout the month of May on WFNI in Indianapolis, and he is part of the IMS radio network. Davidson is also a member of the Auto Racing Hall of Fame, the Richard M. Fairbanks Indiana Broadcast Pioneers Hall of Fame, and the USAC Hall of Fame. In 2011, he visited the IMRRC to recount some of his stories and memories from America's greatest race, the Indianapolis 500. This remastered center conversation is introduced by the late Michael Argetsinger with an opening presentation by historian Joe Freeman from Racemaker Press.
My name is Glenda Gephardt. I work next door, for those who don't know me. Today we're going to hear two great speakers, Donald Davidson and Joe Freeman, focusing on Indy, cars of Indianapolis. So, that said, I'll bring Michael Argetsinger, celebrated motorsports author. We still have some of his books. If you haven't finished your collection of Michael's books, we still have some. So Michael.
Thank you all for being here. We really have a wonderful program. Glenda, as the Community Relations Director for the Research Center, does such a wonderful job every year putting together this wonderful series of center conversations. And our two speakers today are on a subject I think near to everybody in America who loves racing. Whether you love dirt track, sports cars, or Formula One, we all love the Indy 500. The Indianapolis 500 is really part of the fabric of our American life, in my view. Perhaps some of you feel the same way. Years ago, before it was on television, we remember sitting at the earliest years, perhaps beside our father, later years on our own, listening to the radio. And then as the years went by, we began to get television coverage. And when you go to this 500 itself, it's a dream for many of us. The pageantry, the tradition, the Indianapolis 500 is truly the world's great race, and it's America's treasure. Our two speakers today, Donald Davidson is our featured speaker, distinguished historian at the 500. I'm going to speak a little bit more about Donald in a moment when he comes to the podium. But we're first going to hear from a very special guy who has come here today from Boston, Joe Freeman. And you probably were all at the center and saw the beautiful Joe Hunt Magneto Special, which belongs to Joe. Now, Joe owns that car, but he's also a vintage racer. He races that. He tells me he's even tried it on some road tracks where it's a real challenge, but it really excels and runs beautifully on the oval tracks like Milwaukee and Indianapolis and the other places where he has a chance to air it out. Joe runs a multitude of other vintage cars as well. He just came back from Monterey, the famous historic race, the Curtis, I think it's about a 1951 or 52 vintage car. He did very, very well out of the field. I think 32 cars, finished fourth, and that's good in any kind of racing. That's better than good. So Joe's quite a guy. He is the publisher of Racemaker Press. We're so fortunate to have Joe behind his publishing company. So many wonderful titles come through his publishing company. It's a tremendous contribution to the literature of our sport. It's a tremendous contribution to our sport to have these precious memories maintained in such a handsome format. So now, Joe is an interesting man, and he starts by being an enthusiast. He has all these intellectual capabilities, but it really starts that he's a tremendous enthusiast for the sport. He raced back in the intense days of Formula Ford, really proved his mettle at that. He has segued over the years now into vintage racing, where he's a great supporter. But it goes beyond that. Joe was president of the American Society of Historians. He was also president of the Lars Anderson Auto Museum in Berkeley, Massachusetts, a very distinguished collection that Joe was president of. And they said he was the president of the Society of Automotive Historians. He's a fine writer himself. It's really a great pleasure to open our program today by bringing Joe to podium. And I think, Joe, you're going to start right there. Is that right?
Thank you very much, Michael. every big rock concert always has a sort of opener act. And so I'm the opener act, because there's a much bigger act to follow. And I thought about, well, I'm the opening act, well, what better than to bring the boys the toys? So, this is a collection of cars, many of which won the Indianapolis 500 during a particular era. It was called the Roadster era. For those of you who are not familiar with that term, I'll try to explain it. During the 30s and early 40s, basically most American championship racing was done on mile and half-mile dirt tracks. Where racing was pretty much a standard setup. The engine was in front of the driver sat, the drive shaft went underneath his legs, and it was called an upright. The last upright to win the Indianapolis 500 was Troy Ruttman in the 98 and won in 1952. Those cars, along with some front drive cars, had pretty much dominated the speedway up until that time. But people were beginning to realize that cars with front drive were not only heavy, they were also difficult to drive at the speedway. As a result, they were seeking a better method. They were also seeking to save money by using the car that they ran for the national championship in dirt tracks all over the country to win the Indianapolis 500. And a man by the name of Eddie Kuzma made that 98 car, and basically Troy Ruttman, who was very young at the time, but a real talent, won the race. But that really was kind of the end of the upright at Indianapolis, because in the next year, two famous designers by the name of Travers and Kuhn, along with another designer by the name of Frank Curtis, got together and decided to design a car with the standard 255 cubic inch Offenhauser engine, a four-cylinder double overhead camshaft engine that put out about 400 horsepower when it was tuned right and running on alcohol. What's unique about what Frank Curtis did is that instead of having the engine straight up and down in the car with the drive shaft running between the driver, he lowered the whole weight by tilting the engine to the side and putting the driver beside the drive shaft and lowering the weight and the roll center of the car. That was a huge advantage. And in 1952, when Ruttman won, the only reason Ruttman won is because when they brought out Bill Vukovic's, who he was the driver, the first of this driver in Kuhn called fuel injection special, Stu Hilborn who made the fuel injection, why Vukovic was leading and his steering broke. But he was way ahead, and everybody realized, wow, look at this thing. This is faster than anything we've seen. As a result, it was called a 500A. They made 4 of those cars. Pretty much everybody saw the light and said, wow, these uprights, they're going to be hard to manage. That was the origin also of the term Roadster. I want to read from a book that if you don't have it, you should try to get it. It's one of the best books ever written on the technical aspects of the Indianapolis cars by Roger Huntington. It's the design and development of the Indy car. And what he wrote was, so what was so special about this Roadster? What was a Roadster anyway? The trick that distinguished this new Curtis-Craft 500A chassis was simply offsetting the drive line approximately 9 inches left of center and positioning the driver's seat to the right and on the drive shaft level. Plus, the engine was tilted 36 degrees to the right to lower its center of gravity. Then, because of the low seating of the driver, the body was more or less up around him. Only the driver's head and shoulders projected out, in contrast to the plastic straight-type car where the driver sat high and pretty much in the open. From this came a very rapid transition. The evolution was that upright cars and that initial 500A were what were called rail frame cars. They were built around 2 major rails, the engine was bolted between. That was the primary support of the car. There were bars to support the body, but the main frame rails were these 2 large rails. Frank Curtis quickly realized that that was not necessarily the best way to go. And he began to modify the 500A and literally produced the 500B, 500C, 500D, all with, interestingly enough, different suspension designs. All of these cars had a certain kind of suspension that's called 4-bar or torsion bar suspension, either laterally or across the front of the car. So he was quite successful. In 1955, Bob Schweikert won the race with a 500C. Bill Vukovic won in 53 and 54. Was tragically killed in an accident, not of his own making, in 55. Bob Schweikert, fantastic driver, won with a 500C in 55. Then a young man by the name of AJ Watson who had been hanging around Indianapolis and who had made something called the Pots and Pans Special, which was this famous silly car that they really threw together out of any metal they could find. Brought it to the Speedway. They had a little trouble with it. It qualified, but it didn't finish the race. AJ Watson had his own idea about things. Instead of laying the engine on the side, he moved the engine over to the left side of the car. And as a result, in 1956, Pat Flaherty took his first major car, and also AJ Watson fitted this car together with a space frame. That means tubes welded together. That became a pattern for all of the Roadsters after that. It was a space frame, tubes welded together to make the frame instead of two big rails down below. Very quickly, other people began to see the advantage of this. They changed the suspension, and there was innovation at the time. I brought these two. They're both 1955, 1956. They're both 500C, 500D, but the engine is put in a different place than where the winners were. So there was innovation going on at the time. Then, an interesting man by the name of George Sally and a friend of his, Quinn Eckerly, got together to work on, for a man by the name of Sandy Blonde, I believe that's proper pronunciation, to produce a really, truly radical car. That's this car here, the winner in 57 and 58, with Sam Hanks and Jimmy Bryan. That laid the engine absolutely flat, lowered the weight of gravity. The guy shaft again ran alongside the driver. They had to make some modifications pretty often to be able to do that. But this was a real groundbreaker. But Watson wasn't to be deterred. He went to work for a man by the name of Bob Wilkie, owned a successful company in Milwaukee called Leader Cards, and he designed basically his standard roadster for Bob Wilkie. And in 1959, Roger Ward took that to the win. That became really the pattern for the rest of cars from then on. That is in the roadster era. In 1961, AJ Foyt won, raced in a Watson copy. What's fascinating, Don and I were just discussing before this, Travis just copied that, absolutely rail for rail, from Watson. Watson didn't seem to care. One of the deals that Watson had made with Bob Wilkie was that he would be allowed to make cars for other people, but Floyd Travis just made this car, and AJ Foyt won his first 500 with that. At the same time, they were all driving dirt cars as well. They were still driving uprights. Again, the majority of the national championship was on dirt tracks like Springfield, Illinois, DuQuoin, the Indy Mile. There are a number, Trenton was actually not dirt, and Milwaukee was not dirt, but they were racing those types of cars. But those were the dirt cars. The Roadsters were really the cars for the pavement. Then Watson continued to build, continued to refine his design. A man by the name of J.C. Agajanian, combined with a superb driver, very aggressive, wonderful man by the name of Parnelli Jones, Rufus Parnelli Jones, and they won the race in 1963, a kind of a controversial race. What happened was that in 1963, a man by the name of Dan Gurney, American racer, had looked at and had seen that the rear-engine formula cars over in Europe were really being swept the field. John Cooper had started the revolution, and it was now a real revolution. This meant that pretty soon somebody was scratched their heads. John Cooper did bring 61. He brought the Cooper over. It was undersized engine, but his driver, Jack Brabham, did well, finished ninth with the car, but the car handled beautifully through the corners, and everybody recognized that. At the same time, Dan Gurney put together the Ford Corporation, Colin Chapman of Lotus, and a great driver by the name of Jimmy Clark, and Dan Gurney. These four, they developed a Ford engine based on a stock block, Fairlane, V8, put together a rear-engine racing car which they brought to Indianapolis. They came within a hair's breadth of winning. It was a controversial situation, I don't want to get into now, but he had it made. Parnelli Jones won the race with a Roadster. Jim Clark came back in 1964, but had a lot of trouble with his tires. The tires were being provided primarily by Firestone in these days, although when he came in 64, AJ Foyt was no fool. He looked at the fact that the tires were wider on the Lotus than his, and he said, I want a set of those tires. They said, no, we need those for the rear Indy car. Foyt said, nothing doing. Everybody gets the same stuff. So they had to run out and make a bunch of wider tires, and Foyt won with this car, making the famous statement, I won a hell of a lot of money with this dinosaur, which they were being called at that time. But finally, in 1965, Jim Clark and the Lotus prevailed and basically started the rear engine revolution. For all intents and purposes, wiped out these Roadsters. I have an example. This is a Grand Prix car. I do not have a model of the Lotus that Jim Clark brought. I'll get one, but I won't. But the other aspect of this, there are obvious advantages. First, you have a much less of a penetration through the air. You could use aerodynamics for downforce. Obviously, the roll center was lower, the driver was laying down, the engine was behind him, the gearbox was behind him, the weight center would be different, and things progressed very rapidly until you had this car, which, for example, Bobby Unser won in 1975, and as you can see, it's radically different from the last Roadster to win in Indianapolis, which was AJ Foyt's Watson Roadster. What's fascinating about all of this, too, is that not only was this all informal, it was a whole bunch of guys in Southern California that were doing this. They were all hot rodders, ex-hot rodders, or ex-aviation people. They never made enough money out of this. There was a whole slew of them. I mentioned Eddie Kuzma, Floyd Trevis, AJ Watson, a man named Judd Phillips, Luigi Lasowski, man who made my car, Fat Boy Ray Yelling, who made two cars. They're basically Watsons, exactly the same design, but Ewing was known for his beautiful metalwork, and if you take a look at the car, you're able to see it's a really beautiful piece of machinery. But under any circumstances, this era is beloved. These cars are loved. They had a wonderful sound and a wonderful presence at the Speedway, and for the approximately, well, really 10 years that they were the primary car in the field in Indianapolis, they were fabulously successful and very interesting, very innovative in their own way, and I can tell you also wonderful fun to drive. Thank you very much.
Well, Joe Freeman has done a wonderful job of setting the stage with his unique perspective on the Roadster era. Interestingly enough, Donald Davidson, who's about to come to the podium, came first to Indianapolis in 1964, the very year that the Roadster won for the last time. Now, Donald was there as a very young man who had written to Sid Collins, who was the voice of the 500, and Sid was just fascinated by the knowledge this young Englishman had about the sport. And when he got to the 500, he put Donald on the air, expecting perhaps to have him on for 2 minutes. Well, everyone was in the booth was so fascinated by Donald that I think he was on for 10 minutes, perhaps. They invited him back the next year. He came back as a scheduled guest, was on for a good long time, and after that was offered a job and has been in Indianapolis ever since. Now, the story's not quite as simple as that, but it's really a wonderful story. Donald is distinguished not only as the historian at the Speedway, but such an accessible man. He helps people without question. Not only is he such a source, but he's so willing to share. Donald is a distinguished radio commentator. He's also a television commentator. He really has touched all forms of the sport, and he's a much beloved figure in our sport. He's still a young guy, and we're going to bring him to the podium right now.
All right. Well, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for that very nice introduction about the fact that I'm still young. When Michael first asked me if I would come up and do this and explain what the format was, and that they were going to do 4 major racetracks this year, and would I come up and talk about the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. So my original thought was, which only lasted a few seconds, and that is that, well, I've got to do a sort of a brief history of the track and not 101, and maybe something pretty close to it. And then I immediately thought, you know what? No, I don't need to do that, because the people that would come to this, people that are part of this whole rock and swing movement and the research library and so on and so forth, anybody that's going to come to that, they already know that stuff. Or maybe they don't care, because there's so many different forms of motorsport, and there's some people that, although I think that everybody that has a basic interest in motorsport, the Indianapolis 500 has come up at some point, whether they were looking at it from the Jim Clark point of view, or whether they were looking from the Parnelli Jones point of view, everybody sort of kind of has a connection with it. Anyway, I thought, well, probably it would really be better if I just basically do Q&A, rather than just sort of, put my glasses on and read a paper, or which I never do, because I do this stuff off the top of my head, but rather than do it from a historical point to begin with, I thought that probably we could do a bunch of history based on the questions that you asked me. So, to just sort of kind of get into the thing a little bit, we'll do general Q&A. I don't think really explore. I mean, there's all kinds of things I can tell about the Speedway, but I think you either already know it or you don't care, and maybe the specific things that you'd like to be talking about. If you're not entirely familiar with what I do, I'm very fortunate in that I have this. I know I've worked for the United States over a few years, but then it ended up that I went to work for the track. I actually became an historian in 1998. The title's Historian of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. We think, nobody that I've talked to, we do not believe that there is another racetrack in the world that has a historian that's on a full-time staff. Most tracks will have a historian, but it's either a part-time situation or a donation of time, but I'm actually on a payroll, and we think it's the only one. And it's a full-time job, believe me. I'm a historian by nature as well as by vocation. Being very blessed. I'm not a gearhead. I have no mechanical knowledge at all. When I tell people when I get ready to do the Q&A, I'm really not into controversy, and I'm sure that there's a number of the questions that you have will be of a require going into a controversial area, which I just as soon not do. But I also, won't duck out of fairness to, out of respect for you, wanting to get my opinion on something. Anyway, I'm not a gearhead. I memorized a bunch of stuff parrot fashion. So if you have a question of a technical nature, I can probably give you a halfway decent answer. I memorized it parrot fashion. I don't know what the hell I'm talking about when I'm giving you the answer. I'm really about the people. Being blessed to meet a lot and, go to some of their homes and get to know the families and so on and so forth. So, I guess just basically whatever you would like to talk about.
I just noticed a friend of mine sitting on the other side of the stadium, and he's a cousin, nephew, or something of Andy Granatelli. Do you have any good Andy Granatelli?
What was the connection with Andy Granatelli?
I believe this Angelo on the other side is the nephew, cousin.
Oh, he is a Granatelli.
No.
Whether you are a relative or not will depend on how I answer this.
I don't think so.
Andy Granatelli, just an extraordinary person. I think probably the greatest showman, the 60s and 70s, probably the greatest showman ever. Just an extraordinary person in that, because of his size for much of his life, that he is still operating. Because I remember when he had the red turbans and he would be running up and down, and I think he was probably 48 at the time, and I thought, that guy's never going to see 50. Well, next March he's going to be 90. It's amazing. I think it's March 17th or something, he's going to be 90 years old. He has difficulty getting around, but that's been true for many, many years. But he is as sharp as a tack. He has a really strong, deep voice. He talks 100 miles an hour. I mean, he trips over himself because his brain is working so fast. And I mean, the guy is just a genius, an innovator. Although I think that he would like for you to believe that many of the ideas were his own. But I think that what he did was, and some of them probably were his own, but I think he also surrounded himself with people who were knowledgeable and had ideas and put into reality what other people had thought might work. He did actually drive at the Speedway and made a qualifying attempt in 1948. And the trivia about that is that the number of drivers of these kind of cars, by the way, is dwindling. A few facts here. How many drivers are there living who drove in the Indianapolis 500 in the 1950s? And the answer is 5. How many in the 40s? None. When Jim Rathman passed away, he drove his debut was 49. So when Jim Rathman passed away, right before Thanksgiving last year, that was the last of the 40s drivers. And so now we have the earliest start for anyone who's still living in 1955. There's 2 drivers, Chuck Wyatt and Eddie Russo from 1955, and then there's Don Edmonds from 57, and then AJ Foyt and Paul Goldsmith from 58. Those are the only 1950s guys left. Anyway, having said that the earlier start that you'll find of anybody who's alive is 55, what is the earliest year for anyone who's still alive that made a qualifying attempt? And the answer is Andy Granatelli. Because he made a qualifying attempt in 1948. He is not the oldest driver who drove on the track. There's a guy named Frank Barini, who was a midget car driver who actually was at the Speedway in 1949. He took part of the rookie test, and I think he just turned like 97, 98. He's right up there. But anyway, so I digress. But Andy Granatelli first came to the track in 1946, and he and his brothers had a company called Granker. It was actually made up of Granatelli Corporation, and they were hot rodders. They were on north side of Chicago. Not only did they hot cars, they also had products. You could buy Granker products. And then they became car entrants at the Speedway. They had an association called the Hurricane Hot Rod Association, which ran track roadsters, not these, but like the 32 Fords and so on and so forth. And so when you use the term roadster, you actually have to distinguish which you mean. There's track roadsters, there's these roadsters, which is a complete misnomer because those were built for tracks. And the term actually refers, as Joe explained, really just to the Vukovich car was just the roadster. And my personal preference is the attention off of attention. You see the term roadster all the time with a capital R. My personal preference is lowercase r and quote marks because it's a nickname. But anyway, track roadsters was a huge movement on the West Coast right after the war. And there were numerous great stars of the 50s and the 60s that came out of the West Coast track roadsters. Some of them actually, migrated to the Chicago area to be part of the Granatelli Hurricane Hot Rod Association. To give you an idea of track roadster drivers, I mean, we're talking Jack Graff, Manny Lillo, Troy Ruttman, Dick and Jim Rathman, Pat Flaherty, AJ Watson as a mechanic. All these guys knew each other. Bob Schweikert was from Northern California, but he came down as part of it. Jose Elysian, Don Freeland, Andy Linden, Dempsey Wilson, Bob Scott, Jimmy Davies, and you can go on and on and on and on. Well, anyway, several of those fellows went to the Chicago area. Dick and Jim Rathman and Pat Flaherty, and there was another guy named Chuck Layton, Satan Layton. They all went to become a part of the Granatelli's Hurricane Hot Rod Association, and then later that became the Hurricane Racing Association. Granatelli engine cars at the Speedway, I mean, they started out with stock block engines, flanker Fords, which were used Mercuries with these flanker heads. And he ended an Offie in 48, which didn't make it, but from the time you get from 50 on, they were often powered Curtises, and he had an Pat car. He drove for the activation, and then Jim Rathman got a second in 52. And then 54, all of a sudden, he just upped and quit for the time being and sold Granker and was out of racing. He moved to California, and then suddenly he's back in the news again in very early 61 when Lou Welsh, who owned the Novice, was having a battle with the government, and then all of a sudden the Novice team was available for a song, and so Granatelli purchased the Novice and entered one in 61, got there late, they just entered the one car. They were back in 62 with 2 cars, they didn't make it again, but then in 63 with 3 cars, they did something that Lou Welsh had never done. They had 3 Novices in the field. And it was Jim Rathman, Bobby Unser, the drag racer, Art Malone. Then in 1966, there was one of the oddest groupings, I think, in the history of motorsports, was that the STP Corporation sponsored the Lotus team. So you had Colin Chapman, Dave Niven, and Jim Clark paired with Granatelli. And when that happened, I remember thinking, boy, I don't know how long this is going to last. Granatelli and Chapman and Clark. Well, actually, their 4th season, except of course Clark was no longer around, but they did the Lotuses in 66 with Clark and Al Unser, and then in 67 it was Clark and William Hill, and then the Wedge turbines came on the scene in 68 with 4. Everybody thinks there were 3 of those cars, there were 4. Then, in the meantime, now I really am galloping, Al Dean had passed away. Dean Van Lines passed away after the 67 season was over, and his will required that the Dean Van Lines team be disassembled, and so then it became the Andretti racing team. There were several teams, if you look, like in 67 and 68, you had the John Cobb racing team, the Andretti racing team, they were all tire dealers. How much money did the principal have in it? None. All the teams were Firestone and Goodyear. Well, anyway, so Andretti did his own thing for 68. And then for 69, there was a marriage made between Parnelli and Andretti. But more than that, this is one of the biggest surprises, I think, ever. Because many of you probably remember this team. On paper, the Lotus 64, rear-engine Lotuses, 4-wheel drive, turbocharged Ford, Mario Andretti, Graham Hill, Joachim Rindt. The front row, right? No! They missed the show! Those cars never turned into a race. Mario had a huge accident in practice, and that car was withdrawn, and then the other 2 that Chapman, because Clint Warner and Jimmy McGee had the Mario car pretty much. And then Joachim Rindt and Graham Hill, they were withdrawn. And then Hill ended up doing TV commentary for Closed Circuit TV, or ABC, I think it was. So then Granatelli had moved on, and he was on his way to leading the STP Corporation, which he did, I think through 74, I think is when that ended. Then he was pretty much ousted as a car owner. His son Vince came back in, but Andy still had a presence, and he put STP on the map. I mean, it wasn't a new product. There was a series of business deals that were made in the early 60s involving Studebaker, Paxton Products, McCulloch Engineering, and all these different companies came together. And Andy was working for Studebaker, and they had this product and said, why don't you see if you could sell this? And it was STP, which stood for Scientifically Treated Petroleum, and I think a German had invented this, sort of like in the late 40s or something, and it had been around for a while, and they said, why don't you see if you can, sell this? Well, by golly, you did it. But Studebaker had not stopped yet, and so they took some Studebakers from Bonneville with Paula Murphy and Barbara Nyland, and there were a couple of other ladies. I know Paula Murphy, I came to know her very, very well. Anyway, let's see. I guess I'll wind up here by saying that there were a lot of people that didn't care to have Granatelli around. I mean, I know that he was a thorn in a lot of people's side, but he did wonders for motorsport, because even with the wedge turbines, when they went to Milwaukee and they went to Trenton, they had the biggest cars they've ever had. And I remember thinking at the time, well, I personally, and here I go with an opinion, personally, I never liked the turbines. Boo. I realized, maybe either at the time or very shortly thereafter, that those cars brought in the general public a lot of curiosity seekers. And maybe that some of them, they came once and saw the turbines and never came back. Or it may have cultivated some race fans that otherwise wouldn't have been. So, I mean, I think that his contributions were pretty significant.
Staying on the roadster thing,
Yes.
who qualified from the
Okay.
what year was that? And if you know what that qualifying scheme was, what the actually run out that car at the end? And if you also had an interest in the on that driver.
All right, now his question was about Roadsters, and when was the last one, and what was the qualifying state, and so on and so forth. The last time that we watched them with a normally aspirated Offie, with a 255 on Supercarriage, there were 4 of those in the 1965 race. In 1966 was the last Watson Roadster, and Bobby Grinn qualified for the last row, and that was a Watson Roadster with a turbo Offie. Unfortunately, it didn't get very far. There was an accident right at the start that took out 11 cars. That's the one that there were no injuries. It's not the bad one you're thinking about. The only injury was Foyt, who decided that it would be better if he was on the other side of the fence, and he scaled the fence like King Kong going up the Empire State Building. And as he went over the fence and then dropped down the other side, he actually cut his thumb. That was the only injury. Anyway, Gertie was taken out of that, and Cale Yarborough. I mean, there was some really good cars taken out of that accident. And unfortunately, the Bobby Grinn Roadster got caught up in that. All right, in 67, Hurtubise showed up, and they had 2 cars. I asked somebody one time, Don Shepard was a mechanic. He said, actually, there were 2.5 of those cars. They never finished with the third one, but there were 2 at the track in 67. And Hurtubise drove the one himself, and then Ed Rose from Houston, Texas, had the other one, which he crashed on the morning of the first qualifying day in the hot lap session. Before the days where they divided them down into 2 groups, so you could get 50 cars out there all hot lapping at the same time. The reason that I mention that one is because it comes back into the picture a little bit later. Hurtubise qualified this and got bumped and was the second alternate starter. And then he came back the next year with it slightly modified and re-qualified. And that's the answer to your question. 1968 was the last time that a front engine car qualified for the race. It was Hurtubise. They called the cars the Mallard. Firstly, it was the Pepsi Cola Frito-Lay Special. He burned a piston, I think, after 9 laps and came in, and when the car was pushed through the gate to go back to the garage area, that's the last time that a front engine car was ever in competition at the Speedway. So you want a story about Hurtubise. I think I know where you're going, and I'd rather not. I'll just say that Hurtubise is a very interesting character, and I hope no family member would take it wrong, kind of a sad character, because he is remembered for his antics in the later years of his career. He getting sideways with the officials and trying to fight City Hall and losing. And it's a great shame that's what he's remembered for, because in the early 60s, he was very much of a contender. From North Tonawanda, which is not that far from here, he and Parnelli Jones came back together, and he set 1 and 4 lap track records as a rookie on the last qualifying day of 1960 with the Travelon Trailer Special, which was a rebuilt car, which again shows how things have changed a little bit. That's the car in which Ed Elysian lost his life. The car got upside down, and so what did you do in those days when you had a fatality? Well, you prepared the car and got another driver. And so, anyway, Hurtubise did 1 and 4 lap track records, but he was in the back at the qualifying first day. And then in 61, he was on the front row with the Daimler Special. Norm Daimler was a cider manufacturer from Niagara Falls. And then Hurtubise led the race for that and dropped out. And in 63, he said, we'll jump 2 years. Drove the middle of the front row, led the first lap, drove great battle with Parnelli Jones. He won 4 national championship races. He won a number of sprint car races. And then when he had this terrible accident, right after the 64 500, he had terrible luck at Indianapolis. And in 64, he dropped out running 3rd. They then went to Milwaukee the next week, and he was running nose to tail in right to board leading, we've been running up in Indianapolis. Second was Foyt, right in the 64 winner, running second, and then Hurtubise was right behind him with a roadster that he and his brother Pete had built up in a barn in North Carolina. They were running literally nose to tail, and Ward had a transmission failure, and Foyt couldn't get back up in time. I mean, he got on the brakes, but Hurtubise ran up over his wheel, hit the wall, and then there was fire, and then Hurtubise was horribly burned, and so he was shipped to the San Antonio Burn Center, but within 3 months he was out of the hospital, and then, famously, he had these very badly burned hands. And the doctor came in and said, all right, we're going to do an operation on your hands, and I want you to think about this for a few days. We are going to set your fingers, and however we set them, that's how they're going to be. And he said, can you curl them so I can grab the steering wheel? Well, I guess the doctor about fainted when he heard that, but he was serious about that. And indeed, by the following spring, he was back running race cars again. He ran through the 65 season in great pain, and he'd have the hands would be bandaged, and they would bleed and everything, but he was so determined to race. And then in March of 66, at a time when NASCAR was big, but it wasn't getting the national or international attention, and Hurtubise went down there and he won the 66 Atlanta 500 with Lorenzen running and Richard Petty and David Pearson and all the top guns, and Hurtubise won the Atlanta 500, and nobody ever hears about that. Anyway, he did not like rear-engine cars, although he drove them in several races. In the beginning, believed, as did others, Don Branson didn't like rear-engine cars either, and there were several people that still thought, going into the 67, 68, 69 time, that a lightweight front-engine car could still do the job. And so Hurtubise would struggle with the thing, and I know that the popular memory of Hurtubise is just antics and fooling around with a front-engine car on the last day with no hope of making it. But in 67 and 68 and 69 and 70, he was dead serious. I mean, he was talking about qualifying for the front row in 68, but time had passed them by, running if they'd had better engineers. It was just typical with, and I'm going to actually go back to pick up something that I think that either Joe or Michael made a comment. It was Joe. About in 64, my first year at the track, and if you look back in the years before that and the years later, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway was this wonderful gathering of all these enthusiasts, and I don't just mean enthusiasts only, but enthusiasts with the wherewithal. There were other parts of the country where, whether you want to call them specialists, or they had tunnel vision, or whatever it was, but I mean, typically, you tended to find it, and don't take offense, but it seems to me that on the East Coast, you were either a midget guy, or you were a sprint guy, or you were a stock car guy. You were doing the heavies. And usually that's what you stayed with. There weren't very many people that either went from one to the other. And I mean, you can prove me wrong, because I know there are exceptions. But for the most part, and even in the Midwest, but it seemed to be that on the West Coast, there was all of this diversity, and everybody was into everything. But I'm talking about hot rods, drag racing, motorcycle racing, and sports car racing. And a lot of the West Coast people, Saturday night, they would be at Ascot Park at a sprint race. And then the next day, they'd be at Riverside for a sports car race. Or it would be stock cars on a road course. And these guys would come back to Indianapolis. And if you look, you either see the films, or you can look at the photographs of the qualifying shots from the 60s and the 50s, and you look in the background and see who's on the crews. It was unbelievable. D. Jeffries, the painter, was on Parnelli's crew. And also he worked with Foyt a little bit. Gurney, even when you're into rear-engine cars, Gurney had Calvin Rayburn, and Chuck and Larry Palmgren, and Merck Lawwell. I mean, these are bike racers that were at the top of their profession, but they all went back to Indianapolis. I mean, Don Prudhomme was never on a crew, but I'd see him in the garage area every year. He would come around and he'd look at us, normally at the stock block engines, but, everybody was interested and involved with everybody else. It was just a marvelous, marvelous time. Now everybody is a specialist, because these guys are volunteers. I mean, now everybody on a team has a 401k and, travel expenses and everything. They used to travel in station wagons and work together. And I was talking to Joe earlier about the fact that typically in early 60s and into the mid-60s, there were a number of teams where you had one paid employee on the team, and it was the chief mechanic, and he was everything. He was the aerodynamicist, he was the engine man, and he was also the team manager. Some car owners were very, very much hands-on. There were other car owners that were strictly sportsmen. They wore a suit and a tie. They owned yachts and racehorses, and they owned a race car. If you lifted the hood, they wouldn't know what was underneath it. There were several like that. And it was funny how, I don't know how many chief mechanics would refer to it as my car. That was my car. Well, it really wasn't actually, it was Mr. So-and-so's car. It was my car. And the car owner was the guy with the suit and the hat and the tie that would come around every now and again and wasn't particularly welcome in his own garage because, if we need money, we'll call you. So you had the one guy that was the chief mechanic, and he would tow the car, and everybody else would be volunteer. And they would either meet, at Indianapolis, because that's where a lot of teams were based, and then they'd cram into the station wagon, and then they would all drive together, or a lot of people, you would pick up the crew at the track. When Jim Rathman won the race in 1960, the only employee was Chicky Hiroshima, who was the chief mechanic. You may have read that it was Smokey Unit. It wasn't. Smokey was brought in to supervise the pit stops. He was not the chief mechanic. But the point is, when they came to the track, they didn't have a crew. They picked one up for race day, and several of the people that worked on the winning crew were on cars that had missed the show. So Bruce Clower was the chief mechanic for a Chevy, which hadn't made it. And I think he did the left front, I think, because there's a photograph of him actually doing something with, he's in the shots. Al Keller, maybe somebody remembers that name, was a driver, was a sprint car driver, drove in the 500, and he also won some NASCAR races when they would be 100 backwards on a quarter-mile dirt, paying $1,000 to win, or less. Anyway, Al Keller was Bruce Clower's driver. He'd been in the race in 55, 56, 57, 58, and 59, and then they missed it in 60, so I think he was on the right front. Now, when's the last time you had a driver miss the show, and then they get a job as a volunteer on a pit crew? Been a while. Anyway, I talked with AJ Watson quite a bit just recently. He was telling me about the people that would come over to his shop in Glendale to help build the cars on a volunteer basis. And I think, boy, how times have changed. He said that there was one guy, he said, we had a guy named Dallas Roy, and we paid him $75 a week. But he had several of his friends, Larry Shinoda, a guy named Leroy Kane. One time, he had 5 guys on his crew, all with the first name George, and they had nicknames. There was Flat Out George, there was Hollywood George, and then there was a guy that had a really strange personality, and he was Miserable George. I can't remember what Miserable George's name was, but Watson said, we never built any cars in Indianapolis. He said everything we ever built was in Glendale, but he said the guys would come over after work and help put the cars together. So they volunteered to build cars that they were going to go back to Indianapolis and volunteer to be on a crew just to be part of it. And then if they finished first, second, or third, maybe they gave them a couple $100 or maybe nothing. But anyway, they were just unbelievable days.
There's a driver who most of us in this room, I think, revered quite a bit. He was a great sports car driver in the late 50s and early 60s, Walt Hanscom. Could you just elaborate for some of the people that do not understand his Indianapolis career at 64?
Yeah, absolutely. The gentleman asked about Walt Hanscom, and I remember that when Michael first called me and said, I'm going to do a book on the history of Walt Hanscom, I said, whoa, that's a pretty specialized subject, because he was sort of revered within those circles, but I think that, a lot of people, even at the time he was running, when he showed up at the Speedway, a lot of people didn't know who he was. Well, he was 44 when he came to Indianapolis in 64, which at that time was the oldest so-called rookie. The first time I think I was aware of Walt Hanscom was that he won in 1959, 58 or 59, had to be 58, at Silverstone. He won the production car race before the Grand Prix with a Jaguar Mark 7. And I think that's probably the first time that I was aware of him. I might have known about him before that because I would read Autosport, and I'm dating myself here, but circa 56, 57. And there was a lady named Ruth Sands Bentley who used to write the report, so I'm sure that I saw his name several times. But he was Mark Donahue's mentor. So how he got connected with Indianapolis, I really don't know. I did meet him very briefly. He was quite tall. I think he was about 6'1", maybe. He was tall, and then also I was surprised that he had a very high voice. It was sort of like a high sing-song voice. Anyway, so he was part of the Shell Valley. Good luck spelling that, except it's slightly easier than Roman Slobodinsky. He was the, I think he was like a BMC dealer up in San Francisco. So how that team came about, I have no idea, because it was an interesting bunch. Peter DiPaolo was the team manager, and AJ Foyt was in the mix to drive one of the cars. So there were three of them the first year, and it was Pedro Rodriguez and Walt Hanscom and then maybe Foyt. Foyt actually tested the one which had number 1 on it. He tested it, I think, in either like late March, early April, and then it was injured, and then he drove it in May, but I think only for 1 day, and then got out of it. So I think he'd already decided in the spring, I'm going to drive this. But he did take it out one more time, and then it became Bob White, car number 54. Pedro Rodriguez had a shunt with his. He was out, and so was the car, because we didn't do no backups in those days. There may be another car to drive, but it wouldn't have the same number in it. So then Walt Hanscom had the car that was blue, number 53. So the thing about both of those drivers is, I'd say Bob White had his finest run. He had a long career at the Speedway. He had 11 starts, and he was a very steady driver who normally, he was jacked there the first couple of years, but from that point on, he was very much of an enduro driver, and then maybe to some people thinking, well, he's a coast and collect. But he figured, look, if I just sit out here and run all day, and cars drop out, and I stay in the hunt, and I can finish 7th, and make a buck, that's good, isn't it? But I mean, who knows? Maybe he was running 110, well, you can't run 110%, you can run 100%. He did get up to 3rd at one point, and then dropped out. Having said that about Foyt, golly, when they went back to Monza for the second time in 1958, and the surprise of surprises was that Luigi Musso, with a Ferrari, won the pole, and Phil Hill says that the engine in that car was out of the Portago's record for Mila Mila. Did anybody know that? Yeah, okay, then. And again, that shows you how different things were. We did an engine for this car. Well, how about this one out of the Portago fatality that killed a bunch of people? We need that engine. So anyway, in it goes, and Musso won the pole with a big top-heavy car. Anyway, the fastest of the Americans was Paul White with the most heel Curtis. Anyway, we're supposed to be talking about Walt Hanscom. The race started, actually Walt Hanscom plays a little bit of a role in this. At the end of the second lap, not the end of the first lap, as often as reported, but the end of the second lap, there was this terrible accident with David Donald and then ultimately Eddie Sachs and a bunch of other cars were taken out. They were down for an hour and 42 minutes and then restarted. Several things happened with people coming from the back to the front, people coming from the front to the back. And it was on that day that probably Bobby Marshman stamped himself a major contender, which is another very interesting person, that there seems to be a revival of interest on him. I've been asked about Bobby Marshman quite a bit, like in the last 4 or 5 years. And my answer was, he was Rick Mears before you had Rick Mears. But anyway, in the back, Walt Hanston came up through the pack and actually ran third for quite a few laps. It would have been around the time, I'm not sure if it would be before or after Hurricanes fell back and then was out, but you had Marshall was the early leader, Clark was an early leader, and then you had Parnelli Jones and Foyt had a great battle for about 6 laps. Parnelli had the problem with apparently static electricity caused the fuel tank to blow, and so then Foyt was pretty much cruising from that point on with Roger Ward in second, having a fuel mixture problem and having to make a lot of stops. But behind all of that, for a while, Hanskin ran third. They had a lengthy pit stop at some point, and the pit stop was like maybe a 15-20 minute stop. And I've heard some reports that they thought, well, we're out, and Hanskin said, oh, let's keep running. You know, I mean, he knew about enduros, and the people thought that, and we keep going. So he actually was running at the end of the race. He was 13th and quite a few laps behind. And then he went to Milwaukee in August because Lotus with Ford, they'd run Indianapolis with Clark and Gurney. They were going to do Milwaukee and the Trenton 200s. And I think originally Hanston was going to be a Lotus driver, and then he crashed in a practice session. And then it ended up that the Lotus drivers were Parnelli Jones and Foyt. He came back to Indianapolis in 65. I think it was 53 again, except this time it was orange. And he didn't have as good a run this time, but he did make the race and dropped out late and got 14th. And then the trivia is that in 66, he was entered in what ended up being the winning car. He was entered in the American Red Bull Special, John Meekham. And Meekham he joined what are now known as Indy cars. He came into the fray at the 150-mile race at Indianapolis Raceway Park with Roger Ward. But the team for 66 was going to be Roger Ward, John Surtees, and Walt Hanskin. That was the original team. And then Surtees got hurt, I think it was a Can-Am race in Mosport.
Yes.
And then Jackie Stewart came in as his replacement, even though, so Walt Hanskin was to be in the American Red Bull car, right up to the point where they went to Le Mans for a special test in April. And he aquaplaned, and then I think it was April the 24th. And then Graham Hill gets the car and then goes on to win the race. Surtees' version is that Graham Hill subbed for him and won the race, and that if he hadn't got hurt, then Surtees thought that he would have won the race, not quite. There's other theories here. Roger Ward, Stewart and Hill had a double overhead camshaft Fords. Ward had a supercharged coffee, which he wasn't very happy about, and in fact, he even said in the later years of his life, he said, I thought I was the #1 driver on that team, but apparently I wasn't. When I signed up, I'd won the 500 twice, and these two guys had never driven in it, so I thought I was the senior driver, but Stewart and Hill got all the good stuff. Well, anyway, the point is that Hill came onto the team, I think maybe the first week in May. So if you go to the program, number 24 American Red Bull Special, there is no driver because they pulled Hanskin, but they didn't have a substitute yet. There is a car that is normally on display at the Speedway. I don't think it's on the display at the moment. And it's painted up as Jack Brabham's Cooper that finished 9th in 1961. It isn't. What is supposedly the real one is out west, but the paint job is wrong. Always reminds me of that the whole Hanskin anti-liquid suspension car has been restored. The paint job is not quite right. The blue is quite a bit off, and I know why that is, but anyway, the Hanskin car as it's restored is a lot darker than it should be. Oh, the Cooper. The Cooper that is portrayed as Brabham's 1961 car that the museum has came from Jim Hall, came from Chaparral Cars. There is a possibility that it is the car that Brabham drove in the exploratory test in October of 60 to see, do we want to try and run Indianapolis? That's one of the tests, which Roger Ward set up. And Roger Ward is famous probably in road racing for driving midgets, but he also drove sports cars in road races as well, and doesn't get enough credit for that, I don't think. And he drove a BRM in the 1963 Grand Prix at Watkins Glen. Did he drive the midget at Sebring? Yes, but he also drove a B-Hard-M at the Glen on the old circuit. But anyway, Roger Ward is the one that encouraged Brabham and Cooper to come to the Speedway. Because when he was down at Sebring and realized that he was horribly outclassed with the midget down there, but he was very impressed with Brabham's handling characteristics in the corner. And he went to Brabham and Cooper, and John Cooper was a great guy. I don't know how many people get an opportunity to know him, but I mean, he was just a wonderful person. Ward befriended them. So rather than being the establishment that said, boo, rear engine cars, foreigners, who needs them, Ward actually made the arrangements for the test, drove the car, and one of his sons told me that Brabham stayed at his house when he came in for the test. And I'll bring myself back into the fact that the car that is portrayed as Brabham's 9th place finisher, which may be the one that Brabham ran in 60, apparently was the one that Hank Sharp rode that in the US Grand Prix. Yes, sir.
Can I just tell one quick story relative to your comments about the friendship between Jack Brabham and Roger Ward? Not too many years ago, when they both were alive, I was at the Monterey Historics. They were both there, and I was pretty amazed. I had met both of them, but briefly. I was just in one part of the area, and all of a sudden the two come together, and they're talking animatedly because Roger Ward is saying, Jack, do you have any of those Repco parts? Because I have a chassis and I want to put together one of your Repco cars. They were talking like two enthusiasts as we would under any series. I got a great picture of the two of them talking. They were great friends and obviously two fantastic champions.
Thank you for bringing that up because I'm big on the people. When I'm looking at books, I like to read guts. And what I love is beyond the post shot, I love the candid shots where you see the camaraderie between two people. And there's a wonderful shot that IMS has that is evidently after Brabham and Ward had both qualified in 61. And Ward has come by the garage to congratulate Brabham on making the race, evidently. And Brabham, he was a very serious person most of the time, and he's grinning from ear to ear, and there is the equivalent of a helmet bag that is on the bench that is assuming is his travel bag because he's just qualified and he's on his way. Ward has come by, and just the camaraderie and the joy between the two of them. I love that shot and shots like it. Yes, sir.
I will avoid the obvious comparison of names, which I'm sure Bill Green in the back here knows what I'm getting at. The fact that Jim Rathman's real name was Richard and Dick Rathman's real name was James. I just wondered if you would be so kind as to comment briefly on a driver who I think is one of the most underrated drivers ever to run the 500, Mel Kenyon.
Okay, absolutely. Let me touch on the Rathman thing. And this is something that I think a few of us have experienced, and certainly I have been blessed, as I said a while ago, to come to know these people. A lot of stories that you've read or tend to accept as gospel. And when you talk to the people, some have an extra time, and then others, when you first hear a story from somebody, you think, oh, that guy's just crying in his beer and trying to justify it. And then when you talk to more people, sometimes you find out that a lot of what other people have said that were not popularly known turn out to be true. You learn about the people and you learn about the families. When you have an opportunity like to go give a talk and go on a trip with somebody, and then you start learning the really personal stuff, then you don't know what to do with it. And I've learned so many things that I found out that I thought, God, I'd love to run with this, but I don't think it's fair to the person. And one of them is the Rathman name. Now, the easy version is that Jim was actually Richard, as you said, and Richard was James. And when Jim, as we know him, wanted to start racing, he was 16 years old, and he'd have to be 21 or 18, but he sure couldn't do it legally at 16. And so what he did was to borrow his brother's ID. And so they basically swapped names because a little bit later than Dick, as we know him, who's really James, he decided to race as well. And so The 1960 winner, Jim Rathman, was actually Richard, and Dick Rathman, the 1958 pole winner, was Rudy James. Well, the true name of Jim Rathman, once in a while you would see, there was a speed age story that gave his name as Richard R. Rathman. One time he told me, he said, my name is actually Royal, R-O-Y-A-L. He said, I am Royal Richard Rathman. I said, really? Yeah. But he said, well, I'm Jim to everybody. But he said, my driver's license says Richard. I knew that for several years, but I didn't do anything with it. And then when he passed away, I asked the family, I said, now that he's deceased, what do you think? And they said, yes, that was his name. Go with it. So, we revealed that at that time, right? And I do have another one like that. The daughter of Freddie Aggravation. And Fred Aggravation is a very important person in my life, by the way. I owe him a huge deal of gratitude. When I'm doing my thanks to everybody, Fred Aggravation is right near the top. And I asked the daughter one time, I said, his middle initial was L. I've seen occasionally enlisted as Fred L. Aggravation. She said his name was Levon, L-E-V-O-N, which is an Armenian name. And she said his name wasn't Fred at all. His name was Levon Aggravation, and Fred was a name that he gave himself. And then another one, too, was, we've read about George Francis Patrick Flaherty. His name was actually George Francis Flaherty, Jr., and Pat was a long-time nickname. Patrick was not in his name. I knew him a little bit, but after he was deceased, his wife told me, she said, I was from Chicago, and he came back and ran with the Reynolds Valleys, and then she said, when I first went back to California to meet the family, and she said, I kept hearing them talk about George, and she says, who's George? And he said, well, that's me. The older Flahertys called him George. That was his real name. And, there's another one, an East Coast driver from Haddonfield, New Jersey, named Mike McGill. His name was Charles Edward McGill. Mike was a nickname. So, anyway, sorry. What the hell did you want me to talk about? Mel Kenyon, oh yeah, right. All right. Mel Kenyon was, I think, without question, probably the best, if not the greatest midget car driver of all time, then I think certainly since post-World War II, because Bob Swanson gets a lot of votes. But I think unquestionably with Mel Kenyon's accomplishments is absolutely phenomenal. He won the USAC National Championship 7 times, and the total number of victories I think ended up being 111 national victories. But he actually had more seconds than he had first. And I'm just talking USAC National Championship. I'm not talking regionals or other associations. So how many total races did Mel Kenyon win? I have no idea. But there's 111 documented USAC National wins. And then I think if you take the first, seconds, and thirds, they don't call them podiums in midget racing, but the total number of first, seconds, and thirds, I think you're probably talking about 450. He did a lot of his own mechanical work with his brother Don. I'll jump to the Speedway because he was actually at the track in 1965 with a Roadster, which qualified and got bumped. And then it was a month after that that he went to Langhorne, Pennsylvania, and then had this accident. It was a 4-car accident, and he was basically momentarily stunned or knocked out. And there was methanol fire. The thing with the methanol fire was that you couldn't see it unless it got really hot. And I'm sure that I've had a personal look at a methanol fire a couple of times, and I'm sure that some of you have, maybe many of you. The best way I would describe it, it's like a heat haze, a shimmering heat haze. You can't see the flame, you just see this ripple with the distortion in the color behind it. And then if it turns orange or yellow, then it's time to maybe find another place to go. So this fire started and this rather gently, and by the time they got in there and got Kenyon out, the one hand was burned and the face and everything. So Curtis had already been to the San Antonio Burn Center and back out again, and so that's where they took Kenyon for 3 months. His situation was a little bit different because rather than make a decision about how do you want your fingers set, which is what they did with Curtis, it ended up that they did 2 or 3 operations and he ended up with no fingers on the left hand at all. He he just had a calm. And so he was already devising a way to come back and go racing. With his brother, Don, and his father, they devised this glove that would slide on to the left hand and then be tied so that the thing wouldn't fall off. And where the palm was, there would be a rubber grommet. And on the steering wheel, there would be a stud. And so what he would do is to grab the right hand, and then the left hand, you would basically be steering with the palm. And so this worked out very well with widgets. In fact, he said, I've even got an advantage here, because if I get in a tight spot, I can do a 360. I just take the right hand off, and I can do one of these if I need to move in a hurry. And my colleagues can't do that. So then he came to the Speedway. He was out for the rest of the summer, made to come back in '66 in the spring with Nicholson. And I don't remember when he had the first win, but he was making the trophy dash right off the bat and finishing third and fourth and running. So there was the concern about coming to the Speedway. Would he be able to pass the physical? So there was some discussion, but several people went back for him, and then they decided, okay, well, we'll give you a temporary or probation. We'll take a look and see how you do. Well, the '66 race, he just kept running all day, and there was a huge attrition, and he ended up fifth. And then in '67, he got taken out late by Cale Yarborough. Back in the days when we had a really interesting mix of drivers. I mean, we didn't have people that were out of place. We had the best of the best when they were at the top of their game. So here's Cale Yarborough and Leroy Yarborough at the Speedway. But anyway, it was Cale who took out Mel, and Mel wasn't very happy about that. But he got a third in 1968. It's a pretty good company. Bobby Youngster won it. Gurney was second. Mel Kenyon was third. Dennis Holm was fourth. Lloyd Ruby's fifth. In '69, he was fourth. Mario won it. Gurney was second. Bobby Youngster was third. And Mel was fourth. With Peter Revson behind him, although Revson in a distant was down the cylinder, and then some major names behind him, but admittedly they all had mechanical problems. But Kenyon was a very, very steady driver. And then he had one more fourth, and that was in the rain in '73. But I want to go back and do '68. He's been he's injured in June of '65, and now we're talking the winter of '67, '68. And he'd driven for Fred Gerhardt in the '67 race with Thermo King sponsorship. And Fred Gerhardt tells Don and Mel in the spring, he actually took it upon himself to try and raise the money. Now, they were trying to get $15,000, and I don't think they got close to that. But they did have a bunch of local businessmen and friends, and people gave them $100, and somebody would give them $2,000. And they raised enough money, and they ran the cars the city of Lebanon, Indiana special. But here's the point, and when you hear about commitment, how about this? Don Kenyon was the chief mechanic, and he was the only paid person on the team, and I think he got $150 a week. Mel Kenyon was his own engine man. He only had his fingers on one hand, and he wasn't born like this. He's adjusted to this in the last couple of years. And so they had one off the engine, turbocharged talking, when that was a fairly new engine, and they had a crew. Mel, he was in charge of the engine. And they didn't have engine lease programs in those days. When you had an engine, it was yours. And you tore it down and put it back together. And he was the only person that worked on the engine. And then also, he had agreed to drive for 40% of the prize money. What was Mel Kenyon's retainer? Zero. He was the driver and the engine man, and his guarantee was zero. If they missed the show, he would have got nothing. They made the show, cars dropped out, and they ended up finishing third. But I think that is absolutely extraordinary. Mayor Bob Campbell, once again, was the refueler, finished third, so the prize money was substantial, so he got 40% of that, but he went into it with no guarantee at all. There is a little tangent off of this that will involve several names that you're familiar with, and that is the fact that late in the race, Kenyon was running fourth, and third was Dennis Holm. Leonard dropped out with the turbine, so then late in the race, it was Bobby Youngster was leading, Dan Gurney was second with the stop block. Dennis Holm was third with a turbo Ford, and then Mel. Dennis Holm came in, made a stop, because he had a tire going down. and the jack didn't work. Now this is going to sound like a made-up story, but I saw it myself. It was a lengthy stop, and it allowed Kenyon to go to third, and home ended up fourth. But on the last stop for home, and I think it was like maybe lap 194 or something like that, the jack didn't work. Gordon Johncock was out of the race and dressed in civvies, and Foyt was out of the race and dressed in civvies, and they were standing there watching this. They jumped over the wall, and with a couple of other crew members, they lifted the rear of the car up. Here's AJ Foyt, the defending winner of the race, and last year's 24 Hours of Le Mans winner, and he's lifting the thing up by the axle so that they could change the tire. It was a Goodyear car. If it was Firestone, that wouldn't have been. I'm here to tell you, John Cock and Foyt helped lift the rear end up so that they could get that wheel changed and then home and off and finish fourth. But supposed to be talking about Kenyon. His speedway days were pretty much over by 76 was the last time, or 77 rather was the last time. He made a qualifying attempt, but he continued running midgets until about 6 or 7 years ago. And then he finally retired, but I mean, he's just the nicest person that you could possibly meet. Just a very fine, fine person. And I know I've been talking a lot. I wanted to throw this out. From the time that I first showed up at the track, I had met a few drivers. I had met Jim Clark, and I met Bob Gerard, and I met Les Leston, just to stir everything up in the past. But when I came to Indianapolis, and I thought I knew quite a bit about it, probably the biggest surprise that I had was how friendly and down-to-earth the drivers were. I was amazed. I thought that Indianapolis 500 drivers would be very intense, just looking at the photograph and considering what they did. I thought they would be very, very intense people. I thought they would have handlers. I thought they would have an entourage, and they didn't. Almost everybody was friendly. Notice that I said almost everybody. A couple had a little bit of an edge, but for the most part, they were extremely nice people. Len Sutton, Bob Christie, Chuck Stevenson, Bobby Marshman, Parnelli Jones, Clark. They were all really nice people. And even some of the ones that I thought would be tough guys. And so then, as I had a chance to sort of then come back and work for USAC and be around them, and then get into other areas, Richard Petty is a really nice guy. David Pearson is a really nice guy. And a lot of the Grand Prix drivers, and I have to say that I have no idea how many drivers that I've met, whether they were Sprint, Formula One, NASCAR, SCCA. I'd say just about every driver that I've ever met and sat and talked with one-on-one is a nice person. I mean, that's a constant. And like I remember Hans-Harold Frentzen, delightful, just a really sweet person. Michele Alboreto. Anybody meet Alboreto? A lovely bloke. I mean, I'm thinking others like, Alessandro Zampini, but I thought, he was Michele Alboreto, and I think he drove for Ferrari for 5 years. Nicest, sweetest guy that you could meet. Barrichello, this year. Met Barrichello, a very, very nice guy. And Jean Elise, he had a hard time this year. And I don't know, I was kind of sorry about a couple of things that happened, but anyway, regardless, he squeezes into the field. He's the slowest qualifier. So the American Dairy Association had a lunch for the fastest rookie qualifier. Well, maybe that wouldn't be too terribly appealing to some of the names that I've mentioned in the past and some of the ones that I didn't. I mean, that's probably pretty lowly. But every rookie was there. And here's Jean Elise. Not only is he not the fastest rookie, he's the slowest person in the field. He could have blown this off. He came to the lunch. And he sat with some milk people. He had somebody with him that I think was sort of like an aide or a handler of some kind. But he didn't know anybody else at the table, myself included, because they sat near the table. And I thought, oh, thank you, God. Thank you. So anyway, he shook hands with the people on either side of him. He got up and went around to shake hands with everybody and exchanged pleasantries. And I'm sure he was a little ill at ease because he didn't know anybody, and they were race fans, but couldn't really talk his kind of language. Then at the end of the thing, they do a toast of milk. there's bottles of milk on every table, and then everybody, salutes. So he filled his glass, and he clinked on either side, and then he did something I've never seen anybody else do before. He got up and then clinked everybody else at the table. And I thought, what a prince. And then on the night before the race, they had the last row party, and he went to that. I mean, he went to some other functions as well, so he didn't stay very long. But anyway, I thought he was an absolute prince, and the crew guys, some of them were, Indianapolis born and raised, said what a really nice guy he was. And then Barrichello, that was a real treat, because everything that I had gathered about him, from the time he first came on the scene, and whenever he won his first Grand Prix, which I think, was it in Brazil, was his first Grand Prix, and he was just totally euphoric and pouring the champagne on his head and everything like that. Young, I mean, wasn't he like 21 or 22, I think, when he first came on the scene? Anyway, here's all these years later, so he finally came to the track, and he had his wife and his kids with him. I had an opportunity to meet with him, and I said, did you ever have a chance to come over to the museum when you were running that one? And he said, no. And I said, well, if you'd like to come over, there's something that I think you would enjoy seeing. And I don't know that I told him what it was. Well, it was a Stewart that he ran in '98. It's in an area where we don't normally take people. So he came over with the wife and the kids, and we went into this area, which has a lot of vehicles. And he immediately said, oh, there it is over there. And it was way on the other side of the road. And we went over, and it was really neat to watch him look at the car and just sort of go around the back and look underneath and just, oh yeah, remember that, remember this. And it was just sort of like he was just reviewing an acquaintance with an old friend. And that was just a delight. But I guess I didn't need to tell you that story necessarily, but just over the years, so many of them that I've met that just were extremely nice people. All right, yes sir.
Given the extraordinary history of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway 500 over the past 100 years with the automobile, the driver, the mechanics, the fans, where are we going in the future? What do you think the next 100 years are going to be? If you had a crystal ball to look at, where do you think it's going?
I have no idea, and it just bothers me to think about it. I mean, I'm concerned about motor racing in general. I'm not just Indianapolis Motor Speedway, I'm motor racing. I really don't know how to answer the question, but I mean, I've been sort of feeling that for many, many years. So my answer would be, I just happily live in the past. I like front engine cars, black and white photographs. I like doing research, and just a few comments on that, because a number of you have done research, and I think probably most of you, if you've done research, you've done real research. When I have people say, well, I tried to research so-and-so and so-and-so, well, what they did was they sat at the computer and Googled, Listen, unless you've been on your hands and knees going through boxes and getting dirty, you ain't done research. Did you travel to another town to read microfilm? Were you on your hands and knees? No, that ain't research. So I would just say, and not being a gearhead, there's been many a time, decades ago, when I was very concerned about what was going on in the future of motorsport. And I would just as soon not think about it, so I can't really give you, that's a terrible answer, I'm sorry, but...
Maybe one follow-up then, within the past 10, maybe 20 years, who do you think are the present-day drivers who 50, 100 years from now are going to be remembered like we remember Wilbur Shaw, AJ Foyt, and those people?
That's a toughie, because I don't know that there's really anybody, and I don't know why that would be, but we have all these larger-than-life characters. Vukovic is about as iconic as anybody that ever ran at the Speedway. Very little is known about him because he was a very quiet person, and maybe that's what helped the mystery. He only ran 5 times, and then that's another thing too. Parnelli Jones, he only ran the 500 7 times. And Clark, 5, not that Clark's whole career is Indianapolis Motor Speedway, but as far as somebody like Vukovic, he said he just came in and was only there for a very, very time. There was mystery about him. He came from very meager beginnings. He wouldn't talk to the press. I mean, he had his friends, but he was very reluctant to be around people that he didn't know. He just didn't really have great social bases. But then, you didn't have to. All you had to do was be able to drive a race car. That's all the car owners cared about. And then there was something about the name, the Mad Russian. He wasn't Russian. He was Yugoslavian, but or Yugoslavian descent. But at the time, in the early 50s, he had this sort of Russian name, and sort of there was maybe a little bit of, I think say that I was a kid, and Vukovic was sort of like a frightening name. So I think that you had all these things going. If Vukovic was around now, which he could be, but there's another thing too about the way things are now and the way that they were. When I grew up, I just never thought about how Grand Prix drivers got to be where they were. Then after I got over here, and then I understood fully that a lot of the American people came from very meager beginnings. In the rest of the world, that was not so. The way that it is in the United States now, because you hear it's all about money and the drivers have to be from wealthy families or have to be able to get money. Well, in the rest of the world, that's how it was all the time. Most of the Brits, Italians, Brazilians, they came from money families, virtually all of them. The thing is, if you look back now, most of the great American drivers, or many of the great American drivers, could never have been. If it had been in the United States the way it was, and it was that way in the United States before World War I. When you had the Spencer Wisharts and the David Bruce Browns and the people like that could afford to do it. Even Tommy Milton came from a money family. I don't know that that's so well known. But you would never have had Parnelli Jones. You never would have had Foyt. You wouldn't have had the Youngsters and Mario and on and on and on. It's highly unlikely that any of those people would have made it. So is there anybody now that will be remembered?
I guess their history has not been completed.
Yeah, I don't know. Franchitti has now won the Indianapolis 500 3 times, and Weldon won it twice. And Franchitti is a great guy. He's a really good person with a very strong sense of history. And not only is Clark his hero, but it's beyond that. If there's going to be a racing swap meet, Franchitti asks if he can go in ahead of time and see the stuff. and another thing too, just about Franchitti. He's been over to the museum several times, to see Clark stuff. And he drove the 65 winner. In 2010 is when Franchitti drove the Lotus for Road and Track. That goes back a little bit. And when he knew that opportunity was coming up, he decided that he wanted to wear a uniform. If he couldn't find Clark's uniform, and he's got a lot of Clark memorabilia, he wanted to get a uniform that replicated Clark's. So he got him some photographs, and he found out that Hinchman Uniforms was still in business and still making uniforms. And he contacted them, and they said, yes, we've got the patterns. And so they made him a uniform. The Lotus patch that you see on that uniform is actually one I loaned him off of a Lotus mechanics uniform. But anyway, the thing is that when they were going to do this, they had, I think, Tuesday and Wednesday locked out in September of 10, I don't know the dates, but it was right after the race in Japan. So everybody goes to Motegi, Japan. They come back. He arrived in Indianapolis on Monday at 1 o'clock. He went straight down to Hinchman's to try on the uniform to see if it fit. So the guy is just a pure enthusiast. And then the other thing too is that he came over to the museum one day with Dixon, and I think this was last year, and the museum hadn't closed yet. It was kind of late in the day, so there was a few people around, and he comes over and he's wearing jeans, hat pulled down over his head, and I don't know if anybody really recognized it, so they both came in pretty much incognito, and they were looking at the various cars. The 1980 winner is the Johnny Rutherford Jim Hall Chaparral, which is designed by John Barnard, although none of the press kits ever mentioned John Barnard's name, but that's another story. Barnard's design. It's the first car that had ground effects incorporated into its design. Here's Franchitti and Dixon looking at the cars. Franchitti steps over the roof, and he goes behind the Jim Hall car, and he laid down on the ground to look underneath it. And I thought, not only did he mind, getting himself dirty, not the floors on particularly slapped every day, but the very fact that he would get down to look underneath the car, the very fact that he would even know that there was something under there that might be interesting to have a look at. So I've got all the regard in the world for him. But in years to come, how will Kershner Evers, Franchitti, Dixon, Canaan, I don't know how they will be remembered. But you're now looking at the fact that next year you've got two guys that have very little chance of becoming a four-time winner. It was Franchitti and Karsten Evers. In fact, kind of surprised. I mean, a couple of years ago, I thought Karsten Evers was the shoe-in winner, and it didn't work out. So pretty soon, Foyt and Allenser and Rick Mears are going to have one or two more joining them. But let me wind up by saying that last year was the 100th anniversary of the first running. It wasn't the 100th running. That would be in 2016, but it was the 100th anniversary. So several years out, there was discussion, what can we do to make this special? So I had a little bit of an involvement, but I wasn't a decision maker. I mean, I wasn't on any committee other than an unofficial basis. And so I said, can we please do something to honor the drivers? And what I really wanted to do, something with the former winners, at least. Could we put the winners out on the track in one of several ways? At the very least, can we put them in pace cars? And I don't mean 5 guys stuffed in one car, but pace car goes out and there's one guy. If there's other people in it, the family, that's fine. Winner, the guy sitting up on the back, won the Indianapolis 500. Could we please do that? And then beyond that, why don't we put out a blanket invitation? Because the place has always been so welcoming to the former participants. And I think I mentioned that probably 3 hours ago about the fact that they would come back, some of them would spend the whole month. It was just this big reunion every year. You know, if you ran once 35 years ago, you're welcome. And so I said, obviously, you know, you can't pay everybody's way, but could we at least extend the invitation? So the word went out early, and the intent was, let's get as many Indianapolis 500 drivers as we possibly can, and maybe we could have a group photo. It worked out very well. At the time we tried to do it, we first talked about it, there were 270 living Indianapolis 500 drivers. By the time it came to pass, 2 had passed away, so it was 268 living, plus 5 rookies for the 2011 race. On the morning before the race, they do a 1-hour autograph session, which they've done for several years, and I can't believe this is so successful every year, but from 9 to 10, the morning before the race, they have all 33 drivers, and I think for like 5, 6, 7 years in a row now, they've never had a no-show. So they did that, plus they had some winners, and then at 11 o'clock there was going to be the drivers' meeting, and so we had a window between 10 and 10:30, so it would be approximately 10:50 and 10:30 to do a group shot. We had 161 drivers in the shop who had driven in the Indianapolis 500, or at least 156 plus 5 that we're going to tomorrow. And then we had some family members at the end. But from the end on down, there was no interlopers, there was no guests, nobody snuck in. Everybody in the shop was a winner, or was a competitor. And about the only choreography, I guess you could say, was that a fellow named Steve Shunt, they set up some temporary bleachers, believe it or not, with a row of chairs in front. And we had the 3 full-time winners, then the 3-time winners, the 2-time winners, and the 1-time winners going out. So you got 20 guys in a row that won the 500. Danny Sullivan had been there and had to leave. Eddie Cheever was the only 500 winner on the grounds that wasn't in the photograph, and that was because ABC was doing a rehearsal, and they wouldn't let Goodyear and Cheever come down. Boo! Anyway, so we had 20 winners, and then the mix of people in there was just unbelievable. I mean, it was just mind-boggling. It was interesting the people that showed up, and it was also interesting the people that didn't show up. Dick Simon wasn't there. I thought Jose Garza would be there. He wasn't there. Vern Chupan came from Australia. We had Gurney, and then the surprises were we had Hector Rabaki showed up. Bill Whittington showed up. And then Don Whittington got there too late for the picture. I never would have guessed that Whittington would show up, but I'm not going there. So anyway, we had everybody, and time was of the essence. And then Steve Shunt said to me, and this is one of the most unbelievable experiences of my life, he said, look, do you think we should do one more quick sweep to make sure that we don't have any interlopers? And so I checked with Ron McLean. He said, yeah, we got a couple. He said, I said, all right, okay, I'll just have a quick run. So I kind of got down and did a sideways trot, looking up into the bleachers, and I'm looking at all these faces. There were some of the current guys I have never met, and ladies I have never met. But I probably knew at least casually 150 to 161, and probably knew 125 or more quite well. And that was just awesome, and I don't use that term very often. But we had Paul Goldsmith, and we had Art Malone, and we had Donnie Allison, and Shuban, as I said, and Dan Gurney, and Rapake, and on and on. It was just unbelievable. And then did an autograph session that afternoon. Bobby Johns. Oh, Townsend Bell wanted to meet Joe Leonard because he drove the wedge turbine. Townsend Bell was fascinated by the wedge turbines, and that's before he was born. Frank Heaney wanted to meet Bobby Johns because he was Jim Clark's teammate in 65, which was another great story on how that came to be, and how totally wrong on I thought it was politics that got Bobby Johns. I thought, Bobby Johns is going to drive the second Lotus. What? I was astounded at that assignment, and then when I found out what I know, it's a really neat story, but I don't think we've got time to go there. Anyway, the next morning, did a shot with pole winners, and that was so hard to pull together. We actually had 12 pole winners posed with each other on the night of the first qualifying day. So race morning, we had these pace cars lined up. Yes, I got my wish. One pace car per driver, and they had all these pace cars lined up just in case. We didn't know, maybe Sam Hornish Jr. may show up, or maybe Jacques Villeneuve will show up. Nah. So anyway, but we had a car for everybody plus a couple. And the way things were going that morning, I thought, boy, it's unraveling here. You know, Foyt's got a team, Railroad's got a team, all these people have got their other obligations. I think we're probably, if we get 7 or 8, it'll be pretty darn good. We had 15. The only living winner on the grounds that didn't ride in the car with an achiever because ABC was letting them down. But we had everybody else, and they spaced the cars. And somebody just this weekend was telling me what a great job they did, and instead of packing them up. I would like to see the cars a little closer together, but they had probably 100 yards between each car. It was got one pop on the PA. There was no names on the side of the car, but I'm telling you, the ovation from the crowd as the cars went around, because here comes Foyt, here comes Mario, here comes Bobby Unser, Al Unser, Fittipaldi, and all of these winners. It was just unbelievable. Parnelli Jones, if I didn't mention him, Rutherford. And then following that, after they all came in, then we had 10 Indianapolis winning cars with iconic drivers. And the only 2 people that got to drive alone was Lion Guy drove his 90 winner, and Rutherford drove the 80 winner. And then the others drove, like Mario drove the Maserati, the Roadster Maserati, did the whole lineup. Al Unser, Sr., drove the Jim Clark winner. And somebody, I was actually there when he was sitting in the thing, and somebody came up and said, Jim Clark was your teammate, wasn't he, in 66? He said, no, I was Jim Clark's teammate in 66. So anyway, when they fired those up and went out, and you know how big these cars are now, you have to have roll bars, and the drivers have to wear the helmets and all this stuff. That was weighty. And so every one of those guys went out bareheaded. Thank you, God. Thank you. To just see Rutherford go out, and Al, and just, you know, clenching the mouth as they're putting it in gear. And oh my God, I get goosebumps just thinking about it. And there were 10 of them now. There was a last-minute switch. Okay, so Sneva was supposed to drive the Sam Hanks Milan car. Al Unser Jr. was in the Maury Rose Blue Crown front drive. 5 minutes before they went back. And Sneva said, I got a problem here. Can we get the seat back? No. He said, I can't do the clutch. My heel, my leg's too long. And he said, whoever drove this, I said, well, it was Sam Hanks. It was a 6-footer. Well, if the car ran as like a 63, and they evidently had shorter drivers, and still set up for shorter drivers. So Sneva gets out, and Al Jr. says, well, let me try it. So we're playing musical drivers. Al Jr. gets in, and he said, nope, I can't do it either. We need a shorter driver. Mario. So I run down, and this just occurred to me, you know what? Mario came to the 1958 race. This is the kind of thing that you normally think about when you're driving home later that day, but it came to be right at the moment. Mario and his brother Aldo and their uncle came to the 500 in 1958. I don't know if you knew that. They came as teenagers. They'd only been in the country 3 years. And they actually walked out onto the track after the race was over. But Jimmy Bryan won the race with the Milan. And I went over to Mario and I said, how would you like to drive the car that won the race that you first attended when you were 18? This is a special moment for me, and I'm the only person that saw it. World champion, worldwide experience, courted by loyalty, Mario Andretti looked like a little boy, and he said, no, I want to drive this. He's a Maserati. She was little grin. He was just like a little kid. I mean, he was grabbing on the wheels. So that's one of my all-time great moments. So anyway, all right. Well, who's the second shortest guy? That's Kenny Brett. All right. So he was in the Montoya winner. We got him out. Al Jr. got in the Ganassi car. Brett got in the balloon and said, yes, I can do it. So anyway, then this year, to my delight and surprise, I heard they're going to do the pace car thing again. And I thought, really? Not the Kardashians? We're going to do what? So anyway, forgive me on that one. But so this year, I thought, well, you're not going to have as many come back. And so it ended up, to my surprise, we had 12, including John Cobb, who didn't come last year, just being very, very special. And the fact that history seems so important, and the fact that I've made a career out of living my dream by loving history and sharing it. And here we are in this room, and I want to thank Michael for inviting me to do this. I started out quite some time ago talking about coming up here. I can't tell you what a thrill it was to be part of this. I hope that was halfway kind of the stuff that you wanted to hear about. If you had your hand in the air and I didn't get to you, I apologize. But anyway, thank you very much indeed.
I don't think any of us can ever get enough of John Davidson. And what we've witnessed today is the reason the Indianapolis 500 remains the greatest race in the world as it does is because it has such a wonderful spokesman. Let's give one more round of applause.
This episode is brought to you in part by the International Motor Racing Research Center. Its charter is to collect, share, and preserve the history of motorsports, spanning continents, eras, and race series. The center's collection embodies the speed, drama, and camaraderie of amateur and professional motor racing throughout the world. The center welcomes serious researchers and casual fans alike to share stories of race drivers, race series, and race cars captured on their shelves and walls and brought to life through a regular calendar of public lectures and special events. To learn more about the center, visit www.racingarchives.org. This episode is also brought to you by the Society of Automotive Historians. They encourage research into any aspect of automotive history. The SAH actively supports the compilation and preservation of papers, organizational records, print ephemera, and images to safeguard, as well as to broaden and deepen the understanding of motorized wheeled land transportation through the modern age and into the future. For more information about the SAH, visit www.autohistory.org.
We hope you enjoyed another awesome episode of Break Fix Podcast, brought to you by Grand Touring Motorsports. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or get involved, be sure to follow us on all social media platforms at Grand Touring Motorsports. And if you'd like to learn more about the content of this episode, be sure to check out the follow-on article at gtmotorsports.org. We remain a commercial-free and no annual fees organization through our sponsors, but also through the generous support of our fans, families, and friends through Patreon. For as little as $2.50 a month, you can get access to more behind-the-scenes action, additional pit stop minisodes, and other VIP goodies, as well as keeping our team of creators fed on their strict diet of Fig Newtons, gummy bears, and Monster. So consider signing up for Patreon today at www.patreon.com/GT Motorsports. And remember, without you, none of this would be possible.